future of the Sri Lankan healthcare sector. Healthcare professionals who have taken time off their busy calendars to be present here today, as well as our fellow healthcare students. Thank you all for being here, and I hope this will be an enlightening and productive session. Over to you, Ramit.
Thank you, Sadhvi. Before we begin, a brief announcement. In the interest of time, we will not be having separate question and answer sessions for each of the topics. However, a dedicated Q&A session will be held at the end of the program. We kindly request that all questions you have be added in the chat box, and if you're taking part via YouTube, in the live chat. A kind reminder that as these may be sensitive topics, to please be respectful in your questioning. Thank you. Just to provide a brief introduction into the LGBTQIA+ community, their history, and their current status, I would invite Mr. Tyagaraja Varadas. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations, University of Colombo, a researcher on peace and conflict, and a prominent civil society activist. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ramit. Am I audible? Just to check.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Brilliant. Thank you. I can share my screen. Right. Brilliant. Just starting to share the screen. Can you all see my screen? Not yet.
No, we can't see it.
Okay, just a second. Okay. Is it now visible?
It's on.
Yes, sir, we can see your screen.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Now, thank you for inviting me. I think I have never had an opportunity to talk to a group of healthcare sector persons. So this is, I think, a rare opportunity for me. Right. Okay. When Sadhini approached me, asked if I would be interested in doing this session, and then particularly on just to give a brief intro about the historical context and all. One thing that we both agreed, okay, let's just bit of, do some unpacking of whether this is a Western invention or not, whether the homosexuality. So I will be talking a little bit more about that. And then if time permits, maybe I'll elaborate further on the current developments in the country with regard to LGBTIQ movement. So is homosexuality a Western invention? So this is my question and topic also. And there has been a serious conversation around both in the academic circles and regular conversation around in social media and in newspapers, whether this is something alien to our culture, or is this something Western? Is this something another new neo-colonial intervention by the Western countries, trying to invade our culture and, trying to, completely derail the values that we uphold and all those sort of things. And in this conversation, I see primary contention is centered around two ideas. The conservative forces believe this is somewhat alien and foreign, and it's not cultural to us, and it's not the norm of the society. And the response that comes from the groups or individuals or the forces to this is largely centered on the idea that homosexuality had been part of our culture and it was there and it was never criminalized. And they bring in a number of examples to prove that. So let me take two key examples that they bring in. First one is a letter by the governor of Goa, then 1547, who wrote about the King Bhuvanakabau VII the nature of the kingdom and some kind of sexual conduct. In his letter, this is quoted: "The sin of sodomy is so prevalent." He refers to the nature of, back then the society, the Ceylonese kingdom, that it makes us very afraid to live there. And if one of the principal men of the kingdom is questioned about if they are not ashamed to do such a thing as ugly and dirty, to this they would respond, "They do everything that they see the king doing because that is the custom among them." Now, this is one of the key examples that, my friends and also the people in the circles who think sodomy had been part of our culture, to say that the practice of homosexuality or the conduct of same-sex desire had been a part of our culture, and it was never, an alien. So we knew, and it was prevalent. And another key evidence that being used to confirm this idea is this one, 17th century book by Robert Knox. And I'm quoting one of his famous quotation, or the piece in the book, from the book, that we often use to convince people that this is not Western. Most of his attendants, deputies, are boys and young men, he means the royalty, that are well favored and of good parentage. For the supplying himself with these, he gives order to his disaves, the governors of the region, to pick and choose out boys that are comely and good descent, and send them to the court, which means the royalty, the palace. These boys go bareheaded with long hair hanging down their backs. Not that he is guilty of sodomy, nor did I ever hear the sin so much as mentioned among them. So this is Robert Knox, who's a colonial historian, wrote about the ancient Ceylon in the 17th century. And the two examples that I brought here today are basically indicating or suggesting that the practice of same-sex desire was somewhat, not alien. And my friends and some of my colleagues and, in the circles where this is being debated as, part of our culture, the two examples, for me, doesn't say much. The two examples, have not. It has very limited indication as to whether the homosexuality was embraced as part of our norm during the pre-colonial period. What it does say is that the homosexuality, or the term sodomy or the homosexuality, was not known the same way that colonizers knew it was. Right? So it was not known to the locals or the natives kingdom the same way that colonizers have perceived. So this was basically the two examples. The problem that I have with the two examples, not the conservative forces, the problem that I have with these two examples is that these two examples are coming from potentially, probably, a source that is heavily biased towards demonizing local knowledge and practices. Right? So basically, two white men, colonial historians, or with vested colonial interest, and they have written their notes, and there's no indication to show whether this was the common practice among the commoners in the country. But apart from the Robert Knox one, where he notes that the assumption of following the practice, what is being practiced in the court, right? If we go by that example, if that is the case, then obviously we could assume that, of course, if the royalty practice same-sex desire, the public would also practice. But it's difficult to find any evidence to show that homosexuality was a commonly embraced practice in the pre-colonial Ceylon. But what we have, or what we don't find evidence also for any criminalization of homosexuality during the pre-colonial period. So it is safe to say, in any circles, that homosexuality, or rather I would say the the state, the pre-colonial state, or the pre-colonial kingdoms, or the pre-colonial rulers were not interested in regulating sexual conduct of individuals, or at least it wasn't the case, and we don't find any evidence that shows our leaders, our pre-colonial leaders, were really interested in, had a real interest in, regulating how one should have their sexual conduct and the relationship should be conducted. Now, this is an interesting point to say, because the way sexuality is perceived in Sri Lanka is often, shaped by the understanding that we draw from colonial knowledge, right? Colonial anthropology and the knowledge production, more, all those trends. So, what is then we could sort of see even around the world, there is a strong correlation between colonialism and regulating sexual conduct by the state. In other words, there's a strong correlation between the colonizers ruling in the Asian African territories and the introduction of anti-sodomy laws. Now, if you look at the sexual orientation laws in the world, now the countries that are in blue and light blue colors are the countries that accept homosexuality, or where countries where the homosexuality is no longer a crime, or they have more protections for LGBTIQ community. The countries that are in dark brown or red or orange are the countries that continue to criminalize or impose some kind of regulations towards LGBTIQ or sexual orientations of individuals. Now, if you look at the countries in red, orange, and dark brown, or that color, most of these countries are former colonies, like in the African region and the Asian region and in the Middle East. Most of them were former British colonies, right? So then we move on to South Asia. Sorry. Right? If you look at South Asia, right? Sri Lanka, Maldives, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and of course Afghanistan to an extent, were, somewhat part of, directly or indirectly, the colonial rule. So this colonial legacy has a direct link to introducing homosexuality as a crime. So in that sense, what we have is as Western. So what is sort of the Western invention is it's not homosexuality. Homophobia is what we call as Western invention. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka, the criminalization of homosexuality starts with the Penal Code, which was introduced by the British rulers in 1886. The 365 provision of the Penal Code, which talks about unnatural offences, imposes 10 years imprisonment and a fine or up to both. And then if you go to 365A, which talks about gross indecency, again imposes imprisonment up to 2 years and or a fine for anyone, including same sexual conduct between consenting adults in private space. Now, this is an interesting point. Why one has to regulate what an adult, consenting adult, would do in their private space, right? Now, if you move on to further to see some more laws, like another famous law that is being used and that had been used historically to prosecute LGBTIQ community is the Vagrants Ordinance, which was passed in 1842. And it has number of crimes: incorrigible rogues, like vagabonding, and then being escaping from legal confinement. Number of these crimes have been listed there. Now, the rationale to introduce Vagrants Ordinance in 1842 is basically to sort of regulate people fleeing from plantation sectors. So the colonial powers, when they introduce state plantation, economy, the lands were sold to Europeans to start plantation. The labor was brought from South India, and the laborers that were brought from those part of the world, South India, like they were not necessarily, abiding by the conditions under which they were brought to work in the plantation sector. So they were fleeing. So what happened? This has become an issue. So the colonial government had to introduce certain laws to, punish those who fleeing the estates. So this was sort of the one of the major rationales for the colonial government to introduce that. Now, this is for the vagrancy ordinance. But for the penal code, now the penal code, introduction of penal code, and introducing governance mechanisms to govern the civic and other relationship was largely part of the colonial technique of introducing their values into our culture. Now, the famous example is what has happened to Candian law. Candian law was never a personal law. It was always a law of the territory. It's the law of the country during the Candian kingdom, but it has now become a personal law. So these transformations took place because the colonizers had a particular motivation to infuse their values into our legal system. And whether we like it or not, the legal system that we have inherited from the colonial rulers is largely a colonized body of mechanism or colonized mechanism, which we still have. We haven't amended it yet. Now, this introduction of colonial values, right, homosexuality, was infused into the penal code, and the section 399 of the penal code, which is about cheating by personation, affects the transgender community in a worst possible way. So they can be arrested for pretending to be some other person if they don't have proper documents, and the Vagrants Ordinance, right? So these are the four major segments in our law that we inherited from the colonial rule, continue to criminalize homosexuality. And this is how the homophobia is being introduced into the Sri Lankan legal system, which we continue to maintain. So what for me is Western invention is not homosexuality, but homophobia. So if anybody claims that homosexuality alien and foreign, I would say no. What is alien and foreign to our culture is homophobia. And we had a culture, at least, that doesn't have any evidence to show that before the colonizers, we had been criminalizing, we had been punishing LGBTIQ persons or persons who have had sexual conduct other than heterosexual conduct. Now, let's move on to the next one. If you look at South Asia, where are we? There are 8 countries. Majority of the countries in South Asia continue to criminalize homosexuality. Afghanistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Right? And almost all of these laws, except Afghanistan, were shaped by or introduced by the British, particularly India. But India is no longer a country that criminalizes homosexuality with the Supreme Court judgment in 2018, right? Now, this is sort of the landscape of, post-colonial South Asia with regard to decriminalizing homosexuality and the sort of the rights that the LGBTIQ community enjoy in South Asia. Now, if you look at the period between 1940 to 2006, the entire South Asian region were, totally hostile to LGBTIQ community. There were no laws that actually protect them. So Nepal, being the pioneer in the region, in 2007, the Supreme Court of Nepal decriminalized homosexuality. And in addition to decriminalization, the Supreme Court also ordered the government to introduce legal protection and more rights to be granted to the LGBTIQ community. And Nepal was followed by India in 2018, the largest country in South Asia and also the largest democracy in the world. had a significant impact on the LGBTIQ rights, a sexually and gender-wise marginalized community in the world, to enjoy their rights as other citizens. Then the latest country to decriminalize homosexuality in South Asia is Bhutan. In 2021, February, the Bhutanese parliament passed an amendment bill to their penal code, amending homosexuality, amending in such a way that homosexuality is no longer a crime. So that we have three interesting cases from South Asia, India and Nepal for decriminalization process done through the judiciary. Whereas in Bhutan, it was done through the parliament, right? And we don't know what left for Sri Lanka, whether it's the judiciary or the parliament is going to take the responsibility. But if you look at Pakistan and Bangladesh in the third image on the right, this Pakistan and Bangladesh, two interesting cases. Culturally, there is an accommodation for transgender people in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and there are protection mechanisms for transgender people in Pakistan and Bangladesh. At the same time, there are severe laws that prosecute people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual in those two countries. So there's kind of a duality in both countries. Bangladesh, we know there are transgender persons, particularly transgender women, who have entered into legal system and who also entered into their legislation recently in elections. In Pakistan is the first country who has a transgender person representing Pakistan's mission to the UN. Right. So there's this duality also. But whereas in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and Maldives, the remaining three countries had very minimal tolerance towards LGBTIQ community, and continue to be the three countries, brutal and hostile towards LGBTIQ persons. I mean, we may see pockets of openness, but generally the nature prevails hostile towards LGBTIQ persons, promoting a culture of impunity against them, right? And completely demonizing and promoting a discourse that considers homosexuality as alien, which is not exactly. We had a past, our own past, where homosexuality had never been criminalized. At least we didn't have a culture that considered because you love someone different than I do love, you should go to prison. That was not our culture. What was the colonial intervention is that to think homosexuals as aliens, and this line of thinking is not just embedded in the legal system, it's also embedded in our minds. I have seen, our people being discriminated in the hands of healthcare sector and healthcare workers, calling them, you're destroying our culture. I think like this notion of approaching diversity of love has to be decolonized, and that's not just only within our legal system, that's also in our minds. So I think I really like this session about destigmatizing healthcare for LGBTIQ person, but I think it should actually be decolonizing our healthcare sector so that we will have our true sense of what Sri Lankan culture means, what it embodies. It should have a place for everyone, right? And we can go to our constitution, the Second Republic Constitution, which Article 12.1 says all persons are equal before the law. And then, of course, we talk about non-discrimination in Article 12.2, but nothing was explicitly mentioned about sexual orientation and gender identities. But however, Sri Lankan government is in a way smart, and to please the international community, every time the issue has been raised, the government would always rely on this provision and to say, oh no, we don't discriminate anybody. Our constitution doesn't say anything about that, to discriminate. But yes, the constitution isn't explicit, but the practice of law is completely explicit to discriminate LGBTIQ community. The 4 legal provisions in the Penal Code and Vagrants Ordinance that I mentioned before, historically targeted towards LGBTIQ community. It is the police that get to interpret the law on the ground level. When they arrest a person, whether the person is committing a crime or not is decided by the police. We have a police which also think that holding hands by a heterosexual couple in public place is also crime. And imagine the level of, homophobia that police would invoke when implementing these provisions. Now, this is a statement from Additional Solicitor General, written in response to the UN Human Rights Commission in question in October 2014, where the Solicitor General said the Article 12.2 laws discrimination on grounds. Any laws that discriminating on the ground of sexual orientation and gender are unconstitutional. But she also took a note of that the existence of 365 and 365A. So for me, I think we have to decolonize our legal system. We have to decolonize our healthcare system as well. So that means we also have to think about how to think as an independent nation, how to think as an independent individual, where we welcome everyone without prejudices against their sexual orientation and gender identity. And I have this famous quote from one of the Indian activists in September 2018, when the Indian Supreme Court issued the judgment decriminalizing homosexuality. And this was a quite famous quote. What it says basically, this is not India becoming westernized, and it's India becoming decolonized. It's India decolonizing. So decriminalizing homosexuality is actually something that we have to do to decolonize our legal system and our minds. I think, Sadini, I will stop here. Did I do justice for the time? Like, am I in pair with the time?
Yes, thank you very much. I think, you managed to cover a lot of things given this time. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you again, sir, for that informative talk and very fresh perspective into how we function as a country. So, to destigmatize or decolonize healthcare towards the LGBTQIA plus community, it's important that we know what kind of stigma and discrimination they currently face in the healthcare sector. For this topic, I would like to invite Ms. Bhumi Harendra. She is the Executive Director of the National Transgender Network, a subcommittee member of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, a media spokesperson, and an award-winning actress. Floor is yours, madam.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you for the opportunity and inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Before I start my, session, I would like to say something, because this is something quite, I won't take that much time, because I think this is something, very simple and basic, because we are talking to healthcare sector members, I believe, or like people who will be part of healthcare sector. The question always coming to my mind is, okay, I don't justify things, but it's okay, we can understand if we have to talk about gender and gender identities and sexuality for other government sectors, like register department or like HE office or something else. But I always question myself why we have to talk about this with healthcare sectors, because these all things, I mean, gender identities, sexuality is something, need to talk before they enter into, or like while they're getting trained to become a healthcare sector. This is something should be included. And what I have heard is this is something they are getting learned from while they are getting trained. So it's kind of a sad situation that we have to talk about these things, to healthcare sectors. But I really get where it's come from when I actually look back into my journey, which I have come along. So I will speak with my experiences and the cases that we have handled, the incidents that we have faced. So I think why we have to talk about these things and sensitize people, just because of few points which I have noted down. It's just because the main reason why we need to talk about this, I think, the attitudes, and then the policies that healthcare sectors and people following, and maybe lack of knowledge, and and also lack of and outdated knowledge. So like, as we all know, gender identities and, I mean, transgenderism and homosexuality was a mental disease. That was long time ago, but like very recently in Sri Lanka, declared that it's homosexuality, it's not a mental disorder, it's something natural. So we took so long time to realize and understand that this is not something illness. This is something very normal and natural. So I think the main problem what I see in healthcare sectors is, when we are entering to a service providing area as a service provider, um, we shouldn't drag our personal attitudes, personal beliefs into this career, or like into my professional life, which is not going together. Like, I might believe something else, but I might have to work on something else which is not going with my beliefs. But you can't drag those things into your service providing um, table. I'll give you a small example. Very recently, like 1.5 years ago, I guess, we got a case from one of a leading hospital. I really don't want to share the hospital's name and the department or the clinic which that person faced this incident. So one of a trans man who born as a female and going to become a man. Uh, Through this process, we all have to go through surgeries, right? So we have to go and get dates from the clinics, which we have to. So one of our community members have gone to this clinic, and he wanted to get a date for his surgery. So the clinic head is a marvelous doctor who's very understanding and who's very sensitive on these issues and very supportive for the community. So the junior doctors have abused this person verbally by saying that you are, insulting your school, insulting your culture, and you should have gone have sex with a person who have a big male part, which will convert to your normal woman. So, which is like kind of what I feel is really pathetic, because you don't have to. I mean, you can't drag your personal bad attitudes and beliefs into your service providing routines, because you are liable, and you are, I don't say signed, but you are assigned to provide services to people who are coming to you without judging. And I think this leads, I mean, having non-discrimination policies, non-discriminative policies, the policies which includes everybody, and the policies which establish a system which, like, going to provide education on gender identities and sexuality, leads to this kind of attitudes. And like, in our health care system, it's like, I think um, the service providers have taken all the powers, and they think that they can act as who they want, but which is not ethical though. So ethics, and lack of professionality leads to a lot of discrimination and violences, which also uh, we have like few cases that one of a psychiatric who have passed very recently. I can't remember his name, I think Dr. Harish Chandra, have taken one of his clients to the mainstream media to talk about, about transgenderism. So, which is, I think, not ethical. And, the funniest thing is, after assisting that person, after evaluating the trans woman for almost 7 to 8 years, he have decided to not to give him a letter for his gender reforming surgery, just because his daughter have said that, what are you doing, like this is kind of against our culture, and you are trying to destroy our culture, and what are you doing, and stop doing it. So he have decided to not to give the letter just because what his daughter have said. So I think, again, it's kind of a question that where the professionalism stands for. And I know we have marvelous healthcare sector, which kind of system that we have, which nowhere else, like free of charge services, and we appreciate that. And it's really kind of a gap. There's a gap of understanding, knowledge, and services, because like whenever like the sexual minority, I would say, uh, correct me Vara if I'm wrong, um, it's kind of really difficult to I mean, it's always we have to bargain, it's always we have to ask for it, it's always we have to explain about this, which is like, I think we don't have to do, because as I mentioned earlier, this is something you need to learn from the beginning. You are getting trained to become a service provider, or especially in healthcare sectors. And when it's really uh, shameful thing in our country, that what I have seen, entire world, most part of in this world have agreed, accepted, which World Health Organization and American Psychiatric Association have said that this is not a mental disorder, this is not something against your culture, this is something natural. But whatever they will, like when it's come to our country, they will accept that moon is something rounded, and earth is something like this, and this is like biological factors, they will accept all of these things. But when it's come to sexual minorities, this is when it's come to something about homosexuality, when it's come something about transgenderism, this is something becoming, as Vara mentioned, something western concept, or NGO thread, or something going against, or like something trying to destroy the culture, which is have no match with the science, the medical science, right? So I really highly doubt about like where should we start. I think like we have always suggested to government sectors to provide us an opportunity to, if you don't want to change it, like let us come and talk about this. Because when it's come to some areas in healthcare sectors, it's quite surprising when people say that, oh, we haven't heard about this, you are the first one that I have seen. So I mean, like I'm quite surprisingly, and I'm thinking about myself, okay, I'm someone who's coming from another earth or another planet, or like I'm someone who's magic that they haven't heard about it. And the embarrassing questions that always I have been asked, like, have you gone through all surgeries, and why you want to become a woman, and what was your parents reaction when it's come to first coming out and telling about this. I think it's really, I mean, we are already going through, social pressures, as Vara mentioned, according to, thanks to our law and some part of our government. Um, we are already going through some, let's say, bad experiences, bad incidents. Like, health is something everybody's right, despite of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But when it's come to homosexuals and transgender people, it's really hard for us to reach out to healthcare sectors, and this is something, a burning issue when it's come to HIV prevention specifically, because like people don't want to come out and say that who they are, right? So like this statistics that we all have, I hardly believe it's wrong, because like people don't come and say about their true selves, because sometimes the doctors have threatened them like to stop being a homosexual, otherwise I'm going to complain to the police, like this is something against the law. So when healthcare sector people have this kind of mental uh, um, mentality, how we can expect like to I mean, we have agreed, the government have agreed that to end new HIV infections and AIDS in 2025. So we have been questioned all the time, like if you are not letting people to come and get their services without any discriminations, without any harassments, how you can expect to stop new infection of HIV and stop AIDS in Sri Lanka? And also when it's come to gender reforming process, which I have been involved mostly, the things that we have to explain and bargain, it's really crazy, because like it's my something which I need, which is something part of my life. So every time that we are going to clinics, and whenever we are reaching out to healthcare sectors, it's always about describing, explaining about yourself. It's quite burning, because like it's kind of a common sense that not to put a patient or service seeker to a position that highly doubt about that whether that person really want to go to a health sector, or like to get service from health care sectors, because nobody wants to uh, you know um, get embarrassed or like harassed verbally, and uh, being discriminated where you seek support, right? Health is something really important that I think, to have a healthy life, it includes several parts, which as Sri Lankans, we are not able to get it. I think, first of all, there should be a strong policies and maybe I don't know about laws, but policies and systems which the service providers are not allowed to discriminate service seekers um, in based on their attitudes, and based on their beliefs or religions, because religion, culture, and attitudes, there's nothing to do with your service providing side. If you have, I mean, like I before I start before I end my presentation, I think I have uh, spoke a lot. So I actually, this is why I came here. Like I didn't want to do a session. I just wanted to remind your responsibilities, because when you are in a position of this kind of responsibilities, what I always wanted to say and remind, am I a good service provider? I actually want to say something to people who are really want to become a service provider in healthcare sectors. If you really want to become a service provider in this sector, don't drag your attitudes into service providing systems, because that's not, we don't do dash things on the plate which we eat. So don't mix your attitudes in your professional life. So don't mix, don't mess, and don't bring your bad attitudes or like your personal beliefs when it's come to service providing, because that's not what you're supposed to do. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, madam, for that wonderful talk. Next off, I think it's good to elaborate a little further on what we discussed. And for this, I would like to invite Ms. Kushlani Munasinghe, a clinical psychologist with over 8 years experience and a visiting lecturer of psychology at the Faculty of Graduate Studies, University of Colombo. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Ramit. Thank you for the introduction. And good evening to everyone who's taking part in this webinar. And thank you to the Golden Z Club for the opportunity to speak at this and for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here. I do apologize in advance. My camera decided to play up at a very awful time, so I'm going to be speaking without the camera today. Before I get started, I just want to say that this is such a valuable and timely initiative, not only because it is Pride Month, but also because the topic of LGBTIQ people's health in Sri Lanka is so crucial to our understanding of health-related differences and disparities when we're speaking about the differences between sexually and gender diverse persons and heterosexuals. So my topic today is on the current knowledge and attitudes of the healthcare sector regarding LGBTIQ people's health. So taking up from what Bhumi and Tyagaraja also spoke about, just a little bit about attitudes. Attitudes impact the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way we behave. So there are two types of attitudes that influence us. On the one hand, we have those that are obvious, the ones that we consider to be very explicit attitudes. These are the ones that we are aware of and therefore we can control. But we also have implicit attitudes, the ones that are less obvious and therefore they're outside of our conscious awareness. When I was preparing for this seminar, I had the opportunity to speak to a range of healthcare professionals involved at different levels of the system. So I spoke to students, to consultants, nurses, social workers, counselors, and psychologists about their attitudes and knowledge that they had about LGBTIQ issues. So these attitudes that I'm about to speak about are not specific to any particular specialty in healthcare, but they just reflect the range of experiences, attitudes, and knowledge that the healthcare sector in general have. So there were three types of attitudes that were discussed: the negative attitudes, the ambivalent attitudes, and the positive attitudes. If we are to take a look at the negative attitudes that were held, most of these were rooted in the stereotypical image of homosexuality, ones that Bhumi already spoke about, and Tyagaraja Vardas also touched on this. For instance, understanding or seeing homosexuality as a mental disorder, or in some sense, a deviation from what is considered to be culturally appropriate and normal. There were also those that said that they thought LGBTIQ people were promiscuous, emotionally unstable, and also sometimes a danger to children. Homosexuality was also seen by some as an effect of karma, sin, or a curse. When we're looking at the ambivalent attitudes, these were not as direct, but in most cases, they reflected this confusion or a lack of understanding of how LGBTIQ issues were even related to health or the healthcare sector. One of the people actually said, I thought this is something that is related to the psych department or the sociology department or even gender department. We don't really need to speak about it in health unless it is venereology or psychiatry, right? There were others who said that they experienced a conflicting set of attitudes. On the one side, personal and religious attitudes that seemed to conflict with their professional responsibilities, where they struggled to understand or accept the LGBTIQ experiences, but they still felt like they had to do justice by their job. In many cases, such clinicians tended to refer these clients on or seek support from other healthcare professionals who were more proficient in LGBTIQ issues. There were also those that spoke of comfort and being willing to work with LGBTIQ people, but felt that they didn't have enough skill, enough practical skill, or even confidence. So they were worried about what sorts of questions should I ask, or when do I ask these questions. I'm feeling uncomfortable about asking questions about their relationships, or I'm really not sure if I can manage to do that. I'm a little embarrassed. I'm also scared to do that. So whether it is sexual history taking or even providing safe-sex counseling, there was a degree of fear and lack of confidence that came because they felt they didn't have the proper skills. There were also those that said that I'm okay with an LGBTIQ client only as long as they don't shove it in my face. So as long as they were under the radar, it was okay. So there was this degree of conditional acceptance. As long as an LGBTIQ person remain invisible or less visible, I'm okay with it. If we are to look at the positive attitudes, these attitudes were reflected in a more scientifically informed and an evidence-based stance, an appreciation of the fluidity of sexuality, sexual preferences, sexual orientations, practices, and gender identity. They also indicated that they accept and tolerate non-normative relationships. They were okay with it. They also said that we aim to create positive client-centered doctor-patient relationships, irrespective of sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. Some also went on to say that within their clinics and in their wards, they also made the extra effort to ensure that LGBTIQ people were not treated differently by other healthcare workers in the area. So one of the key things that struck me when I was having these conversations was the commonality in the experiences that all of these healthcare professionals shared. And that was that all of them spoke of the lack or the limited knowledge and exposure to LGBTIQ related information and issues in our formative academic and professional training programs. When we enter our undergrad programs, whether it is medical college or any of our training programs, we come into these programs with a set of preconceived attitudes and prejudices and stereotypes, and these reflect the society at large. What happens sometimes in these programs when there is inadequate exposure or limited exposure and knowledge generation, we are unable to adequately challenge these attitudes that we hold, as well as to become aware of the information that is out there, and finally to be able to learn and grow differently. Why is it important that we speak about discrimination and stigma in the healthcare sector towards the LGBTIQ population? There are a few reasons why. Discrimination in these settings impact a sense of safety for the LGBTIQ person. It also impacts their help-seeking behaviors, their adherence to treatment, whichever that would be, as well as it contributes to adding to the burden on the healthcare system at large. But it is also important that we understand that the physician-patient or the therapist-client relationship is a two-way street. On the one hand, our behaviors as healthcare workers may be discriminatory or may be perceived as being discriminatory. What happens is when these negative experiences are created, there is also a degree of uncertainty and fear that the client or the patient feels, and they may choose not to share their sexual identity or practices with us. Ultimately, it will impact the way that we make decisions about the patient's or the client's health. I'm not saying that disclosure of LGBTIQ identity or sexual preferences and practices is essential in our consultation. But it is important that as clinicians, we understand that even though it is not essential, there are some instances when it is important to do so. And therefore, it is important for us to remain open to that possibility and create an environment that is safe and conducive for it. And then leave it up to the client to choose whether or not they are going to share it with us. As we speak about discrimination that occurs within our healthcare sector towards the LGBTIQ community, I think it is absolutely essential that we also acknowledge the tireless work that healthcare workers do engage in with the LGBTIQ community. There's a lot of great work that's done out there by many doctors, consultants, nurses, counselors, psychologists, and so on. And we can't ignore them and the work that they're doing when we're having the conversation about destigmatizing LGBTIQ healthcare. So when a client has a positive experience with the healthcare system, they're also more likely to access health services in the future. They're also likely to promote such services and professionals to others within their communities and sub-communities. By doing so, we can definitely try to reduce the risk and health-related disparities and ultimately to reduce the burden on the healthcare system. Before I wrap up my segment, I would also like to share some experiences myself and some of my colleagues have had in our clinical practice when we work with LGBTIQ clients. And this is specifically in relation to healthcare workers who have come to us because they identify as LGBTIQ. And amongst the experiences they shared were anti-LGBTIQ remarks, bullying, comments, jokes, or even rumors by their classmates and their colleagues, and the significant mental stress that they experienced when they tried to negotiate their identity in such context. They were really scared and they feared of being outed. They feared that their identity or their orientation may negatively impact their education or their job. They were scared of coming out or of revealing their identity to their senior staff members because they didn't want to be judged negatively. But they also said that they had a mixture of experiences when it came to coming out to their classmates. Majority of them have had positive experiences coming out to their classmates and even their colleagues. So as you can see that these individuals who identified as LGBTIQ in the healthcare sector have had a range of experiences, not just negative. So ultimately, in conclusion, I want to leave you with a few things. The healthcare sector plays a crucial role in the lives of LGBTIQ people. While there has been growing positive attitude towards the community, there is still substantial negative stereotypes and attitudes within the healthcare sector. Knowledge and attitudes are two sides of the same coin. Without the proper knowledge, attitudes do not get challenged and personal and professional development does not occur. Positive and more accepting attitudes are associated with accurate knowledge. The limited knowledge and exposure to social issues in healthcare curricula is a systemic issue at the end of the day. We cannot blame the healthcare worker or the patient or the client. However, as healthcare workers, it is our responsibility to create a safe and conducive environment for all our clients, that is irrespective of their LGBTIQ status. Accessing knowledge and becoming aware of our own personal biases and attitudes and prejudices, and at the end of the day, when those may be interfering with our capacity to provide comprehensive and ethical care, is vital to building reciprocal partnerships between us and our patients and clients. And hopefully, this may contribute to reducing the overall burden of the healthcare system. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for that very insightful speech. And our final topic for the day, I invite Dr. Mahesan Ganesan, a consultant psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health, who has a significant number of years working with, among others, the LGBTQIA+ community. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, for inviting me. I think people have laid the foundation for what I wanted to tell. So that will be very useful. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And oh, Zoom is taking some time. Yes. What I want to talk about is two things. Briefly, I want to talk about what is called the minority stress, right? Very briefly. And then mostly I'm going to talk about bias and what to do about bias. I'll try to be brief, but I might overshoot the time a little bit. So if you look at this thing called the minority stress, which is one of the real things that any minority, and as the sexual minority also comes into the same thing. So stigma, prejudice, and discrimination creates a very stressful social environment for this group because they don't know how they are going to be dealt with. They are highly worried how they will be received. And people talked about it, right? And also, you have to be very careful of what you say. Like, for example, if somebody asks your sexual orientation or whatever that belongs to this group, and in case I tell something and that might out, what will happen to me? I mean, this itself is going to be very stressful. And Kushlani talked about it, even among colleagues and other people. So imagine the stress in a very hierarchical sort of environment where there is a doctor or a nurse and a patient comes with a healthcare problem. And how do you make sure the conversation skirts around these sensitive areas, being very careful because you don't know what is going to happen. And also internalization of negative social attitudes and resulting concerns about disclosure. The social attitudes not only affect the healthcare world, other service providers, unfortunately, it affects the client group as well. So they themselves feel they have done something wrong, they are bad. So when patients actually come to me, initially they are very anxious, they are very sheepish, they are very unsure how to tell me this because they don't know how I am going to take it up. And it's very difficult for me as a healthcare worker because I can't ask these questions from every single patient who comes to me. And also, if they don't want to talk about it, I'm fine with it. So this creates a kind of a problem in service delivery as well. And building up coping mechanisms and, of course, system change is very important. Right? So putting that aside, let us come to bias and prejudice. Now, this is where we come in. As healthcare workers, how do we deal with our biases and prejudices? Of course, we may think, oh no, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not biased, I treat everybody the same. As we saw in the earlier slide, treating everybody the same is not going to work. Because people who feel that they are a minority and people who fear discrimination or people who have had discrimination before are going to be highly worried, right? And so we have to make a special allowance for this. Yes, so this is what bias is. So most of us, or all of us, have a cultural lens through which we view the world, which can sometimes create biases. Often the decisions we make are directly influenced by those biases, even when we espouse other beliefs. So though we say we treat everybody the same, if we have a bias, whether due to colonialism or whatever reason, we have got this cultural bias, that is going to influence it. Right? So there are two types of bias. Kushlani talked about it, what is called the explicit bias and the implicit bias. So explicit bias is something that we know of, and we can balance it to some extent. So implicit bias is what happens unconsciously, which is very difficult to pick up. And even I myself will not be aware of that bias unless I look very carefully inside. Explicit bias is really bad, and most often we can deal with it. Okay, I'm going to ask you a small question. Just read this. Can you explain this? A father and son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The son was taken to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an operating room. A surgeon was called. Seeing the patient, the surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son." So how is it possible? The father and son were involved in an accident. The father died, was killed in the accident. But when the son is taken into the operating room, the surgeon comes and says, "Oh my God, it's my son." I'm not going to give you much time to think about it. But is this possible? How are you going to explain this?
Mother is the surgeon.
That's one possibility. Yes, that's true. The mother could be the surgeon, or a person can have two fathers as well, right? You can be adopted. The parents could have divorced. Because the problem is, the moment we think father, mother family or parents family, we think of this dyad father, a male, and mother, a woman, and they having children. Yes, so now these are the things that we automatically get. And this happens because of our biases, right? So unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that we form outside our own conscious awareness. So these are mostly, as it says clearly on top, unconscious. So we do hold unconscious belief about various groups, etc. Right? So it is far more prevalent than conscious prejudice. And it's often, as I said earlier in another slide, it's incompatible with our own conscious values. So even when I say something and my conscious value is that, the unconscious biases and prejudices do act. So I have to be very careful to get them out into my consciousness and look at it. So there are various different types of biases. I've just put two here. You can read about it if you are interested. Yes. So these biases actually start forming when we are very young and are shaped as we mature into who we are today. So what we hear in schools, what we hear our parents talk, what we are taught in said in religious places, etc., do come into play who we are, right? So we all have biases based on gender, race, sexual orientation, educational level, disability, sexuality, social status, job title, or other aspects of identity. And automatically assign presumed traits to anyone we subconsciously put into these groups. So when somebody comes and says, "I'm a doctor," I assume particular traits. When somebody comes and says, "I'm a woman," we assume particular traits. And these are the things that we need to guard against. So what is the problem? So what if we have biases which are unconscious? What are these going to do? So very often, these biases lead to what are called microaggression. So obviously, as very healthcare workers, we very rarely go to overt major aggression. That's possible and that does happen, but most of us will not be doing that. What happens is these unconscious biases that we have makes us to do these microaggressions. which very often we even don't pick up. So when a consultant colleague says, "Good morning," how do I respond? When a nursing officer or a support staff officer says, "Good morning," how do I respond? Is there a difference? Is there a difference in my tone? Is there a kind of a slight paternalistic attitude coming out? So these are what I mean by microaggressions, right? So again, they can be intentional or unintentional, and most of the time they are unintentional. So they are verbal, non-verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities that we cause. So, so when I'm doing my ward round, if a doctor walks in or a consultant colleagues walk in, I might offer a seat. But when a support staff officer comes in, do I offer them a seat? Do I at least think about it? So these are things that are meant by microaggressions. So communicating hostile, derogatory, or negative connotations. So it might be a joke, it might be a comment that we slip out. Again, it can be unintentional. And this will be about a particular culture. So if you go against the dominant culture in that area or in that field, then you are vulnerable to microaggression. As you know, in Sri Lanka, though we say there are 2 or 3 different types of cultures, there are thousands of different subcultures that are there in all places. So these subcultures have their own kind of identities, practices, belief systems, way of communicating, etc. And so when it comes out that this particular client or individual comes from this particular culture, then these microaggressions can come out. So we need to observe our own behavior to see whether there is microaggression, because nobody's going to tell me. So when I'm a doctor, when I'm treating a client, or when I'm dealing with a nursing officer or support staff officer or anybody else, they are not going to tell me, unfortunately, "Hey doc, this is not the way to talk to me. You don't talk like this to other doctors. Why are you talking to us like this?" or anything like that. Unfortunately, we have created a culture where that sort of thing is not possible. So a client coming and telling that is never going to happen. Okay, so what to do about it? So we have these biases, which are mostly unconscious, and they come out as microaggressions. What to do about it? So understanding that for a change to come about, the process of disrupting old patterns of meaning and creating new understanding is very important. So knowing that, understanding that is very important, because it is from this that change of behavior can happen. Okay. So the first thing is we need to acknowledge that all of us have unconscious biases and cognitive dissonances. And to overcome that is one is called cultural competence and cultural humility. Empathizing with your patients, so improving our empathy skills, actually putting ourselves into their shoes, is one way of doing it. And another one is what is called reflective practice and mindfulness. So I'm going to talk about 2 things very briefly, just the cultural competence part and the reflective practice part. I suppose other things you can read about. Yes. So no one wants to feel they make decisions based on unconscious bias. In fact, most of us get very defensive if someone accuses us of stereotyping or making a biased comment. However, we must accept that, right? So very often when we talk about things, people become very defensive of an imaginary culture that they have in their mind where they belong to. Right? I mean, this was the case when we talked about domestic violence a few years ago. They said, "Hey, in our culture, there's no domestic violence. We are so advanced. We treat everybody same, and our religions are neutral, so we don't have domestic violence." So people become very defensive. And then there's no way that we can go forward. So cultural competency is a very difficult thing for us to learn, but we have to keep going at it, trying to learn more about different cultures, try to understand the subcultures, and to have an openness to discuss and talk to them and understand their viewpoints. Otherwise, people are not going to come out and say that they belong to a subcultural group. So cultural humility is one way that we can improve our cultural competency, right? So it proposes change through a lifelong process of learning, self-examination, and refinement of one's own awareness, knowledge, behavior, and attitudes on interplay of power, privilege, and social context. So this is very important for us to have cultural humility and understand that these subcultures have a very rich culture, and to try to understand those cultures through a sense of humility. Right? So one of the things that we can do practice is what is called the reflective practice. So I will talk 2 minutes about it and then wrap it up. So the reflective practice starts around maybe a problem or dilemma or an uncomfortable feeling. Did I treat this patient right? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Sort of feeling. It can start with that, right? So it's a process of examining an experience that raises concern, an internal process that individuals use to help refine their understanding of an experience. So I have an experience with a client, maybe from a different cultural group, and I want to re-look at the way I behave. And that is reflective practice. It is critically questioning the content, process, and premise underlying the experience. So importance of reflection enables us to be conscious of our potential for bias and discrimination, make the best use of knowledge, challenge and develop existing professional knowledge base, avoid past mistakes, and maximize our own opportunities for learning. Yeah. I'll skip this because I'm going to repeat the same thing in the... So why reflect? So it's based on our own practice, capable of developing new knowledge about myself and how I'm treating the clients and about my own attitudes and bias. It's consciousness raising. It helps turn experiences into a learning thing, raises better self-awareness in all of us, and also develop our intellectual skills and liberates us from conventional, traditional ways of thinking. So this is why we need to reflect. So how does it happen? So we first have to make a pause. An intentional pause is very important. And then we have to have the openness to have a look at our behavior and attitudes in a very open manner. That's very important. We have to be very honest about it. And then question about the practice and invite and genuinely engage. So how did I perform? How did I behave in that place? Was that appropriate? And then think about it, and learning happens from that. Deliberately processing thoughts, examining goals, beliefs, and practices. And then that leads to action and further learning. So the pause and openness are extremely important, and inquiry and thinking. So we can look at behaviors, the feelings I had, and the ideas that came to my mind during that intervention or meeting a client who belonged to a slightly different culture than mine. And during that pause that I told earlier, we need to return to that experience, remove obstructing feelings, re-evaluate our experience, and new perspectives on experience can lead to change in behavior, be ready for application, and a commitment to action. So So reflective practice is something that is extremely important because especially in Sri Lanka, once we become doctors or consultants, nobody is going to come and tell us. We need to do this ourselves. So what are the barriers to reflection? Not prioritizing, not setting aside time, fear of judgment of ourselves, fear of criticism of ourselves, being very defensive, and of course, our professional arrogance. And somebody told about that earlier about an experience. I think it was Bhumi. Yeah. So what Socrates said was an exam in life isn't worth living. So we need to learn this practice of a reflective practice, relooking our life and slowly changing our own attitudes, behaviors, emotions, and thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was very, very nice to listen to. It was a good point of introspection as well. So with the end of our topics for discussion, we will be moving into the questions. And I really do want to thank everyone who has been sharing links and making observations in the discussion. It's been good to listen to. And there has been a point of slight confusion also. We will be addressing that. So thank you very much for bringing that up. So for our first question, I will be reading out these questions. And if there's anyone of our speakers who would like to answer them, that would be very nice. So our first question for the day is by Kirtikan. The question is there any possible way to take actions against the police if they take action against LGBTQ people? I believe this question might be best suited to Mr. Varadas.
Thank you for that question. If I may respond, there are several channels. If one individual feels that their rights have been violated, one of the primary channels is to you contest the conduct of police then and there with the proper professional legal support. You can have a lawyer with you, or if you're in a situation where you won't be able to access a lawyer, you can let your most immediate close person know about the situation. Then at least some legal help will arrive. If the police prosecute you, brought you let's say in front of the courts, you can contest it then and there. You don't have to plead guilty. And then if you pass that point, you can obviously always go and lodge a complaint at the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. And then of course nobody has still so far challenged the legality of prosecuting LGBTIQ person in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. So hopefully in future we will get a chance to see that. The point, I don't know, I'm not sure the rationale of this question. Maybe let's say there was another follow-up comment on the terms of the laws. Can I also respond to that because it's connected?
Sure, sir.
Okay. Yes, Sri Lankan law doesn't explicitly state homosexuality is a crime, but this is the wording of the law that has been used in not just in Sri Lanka but in India, Singapore, Nepal, right, in many of the former British colonies. And I think when they drafted the law, I don't think the legal taxonomy did have a word to put it into place. So they used the wording that they had when they drafted the law, right? So I think law is not also about just the wording, but also about how it get implemented. No? So if you look at the practice, the law has been implemented in the country throughout since 1886, right? Majority of the people who had been stigmatized and marginalized and oppressed by using these laws are the LGBTIQ persons. But there are exceptions also, like in the case of Singapore, when you say indecency and abnormal sex or unnatural sex, some wives have actually prosecuted their husbands for having oral sex with them. So because the definition, the understanding, common understanding of what is the natural sex is that, reproductive sex. So oral sex isn't considered as a reproductive sex. So there are cases in Singapore as such. So the straight couples are also in danger if the law is interpreted in such a way. But whether, fortunately, unfortunately, our police is only using this law mainly against LGBTIQ persons because their common understanding about what is natural and normal is the heterosexual conduct. So anything that doesn't comply with that heterosexual conduct is considered as abnormal. This is how it has been implemented. In 2016, there had been a judgment delivered by the Supreme Court where the court held the verdict that it is still a crime in the Sri Lankan law. Therefore, the court, ascertained the judgment that was given by the magistrate court back then. But also the Supreme Court said, where although it is part of our law, we also take note of, the recent developments and the civilizational norms have been, shifting. And this shouldn't be a crime. So what they did, they issued a suspended sentence for the two defendants. So they are still being served as a sentence, but the sentence is suspended because of the Supreme Court's opinion. But it isn't the legal practice, so still it's a crime. So it's better, like what Indian Supreme Court has done. You just have to get rid of the law. Another example that I can give, we know the ICCPR Act, International Civil and Political Rights Covenant Act, that was introduced to Sri Lanka in mid 2000 to protect the rights of civil freedom, freedom of expression and civic and political rights. But we also know the practice is completely the opposite of the motivation of the act. The act has been used in the country to, basically curtail the freedom of expression. So it's also about not just the word, but how the law is being implemented. So if we can't change the way law is being implemented, it's better to change the law itself and to have a better worded one so that the misuse or the appropriate exploitation of law to prosecute a particular vulnerable community can be completely banned. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. There was a question. I think this would probably be best addressed to Ms. Bhumi. I think this was also somewhat answered by another participant in the chat. So if possible, I would really appreciate a clarification on the process of changing one's gender. Can a person self-identify as a transgender person, or should it be after consultation with physicians? And I think there was just a small follow-up. Could you please clarify if transgender people feel the above mentioned way since childhood, or is it something that can develop in adulthood as well?
Well, the process is like when, I'll explain the process that we follow. First, whenever a community person who identifies themselves themselves as a community member who feels as a trans person, we always, first we are having a chat, very casual chat, because recently we have found out that there are actually few cases that we have conducted that homosexual couples having a discussion among them just because they have criminalized in Sri Lanka, just because they want to get married to their partner and live together to have a so-called normal life, married life. Okay, something happened to my view. So,
hello, madam.
Once again.
Your video, I think, has been turned off somehow.
Yeah. I think
we can hear you well. We can hear you well, Bhumi.
Right. Okay. So, to avoid that kind of a situations, like to avoid that trans community members to go through this, process, we are like having a kind of a very friendly and close chat. And also then we are referring to the psychiatric department of the selected hospitals. We have like now 5 clinics in 5 different districts: Colombo, Anuradhapura, Jaffna, Peradeniya, and Karapiti hospitals. So we are referring to the psychiatric clinic for psychiatric evaluation, and then after that, like the medical procedures will follow up. So will be followed up with the clinic, and we are, I mean, not only my organization, there are several organizations who are supporting trans community to go through the process. So like that's the main basic process of going through the gender reconfirming surgery process. So I mean, like, identifying yourself as a trans person will be in different ages, right? So I mean, as if I'm giving an example from my life, I actually had this different, so-called different feeling in different ages from my childhood. But in my age of 20, in middle of 20 to 21, only I understand that who I am, and actually uh, to I mean, in which path that I should walk on. So I mean, unfortunately, in Sri Lankan society, we are not allowed to reach out to kids, school kids under age 18, because uh, we have labelized, we have sealed as pedophiles, unfortunately. So it's really hard for us to reach out to kids. So whenever underage person, I mean below 18, reaching to us, like, we are asking them to first, focus on the studies and finish your school studies, and after you reached your age of 18, you can, come to us for seeking support, so we can support them on that only. So identifying yourself is something depends on a person's, like, it can be in age 5, and it can be age, I mean, when you are reaching out your puberty, or like after getting married. We have like several cases, people like identifying themselves after getting married and having kids. So I think Dr. Ganesh or Kushlani can explain that more. So yeah, that's the simple process.
Thank you, man, for clearing that up. We are slightly over time, but I think it's, since we have some very good questions, it's good to take a few more minutes. So there was a little bit of confusion, and I think probably Ganesan sir, you might be the best one to clarify this one, because it was regarding the official stance of the Sri Lankan health sector. This came up in Ms. Bhumi's speech, and it's about the official stance of the Sri Lankan health sector and the attitudes of certain members of the Sri Lankan health sector towards the LGBT community. Because as I personally know, the official stance has been for quite some decades that homosexuality is not an illness.
Yes, I mean, you are right, and there is confusion because you see, individual members' behaviors are very difficult to control within the Sri Lankan health structure. So a doctor having an extreme bias against the LGBTQ community can still continue to behave in a very negative manner with hardly any consequences. Legally, officially, yes, you can make a complaint through Sri Lanka Medical Council or something, but that process is very complicated, and we doctors are generally very defensive, and we make sure we protect our own from others. We are pretty good at that. So even when our colleagues make really bad mistakes, we rally around them and we protect them, and they continue to go on their merry old ways. So this is an unfortunate situation we have in Sri Lanka. So people talked about, a lot of doctors being positive, some doctors being positive, negative, and that's true. So we have a mixed bag like everybody else. So bringing in more professionalism through training. So we need to talk about the minorities, the different cultures within the main culture, and how to understand that, and also understand, decolonization, kind of develop a reflective practice into ourselves. And of course, we need better complaint procedures and better ways of responding without the doctors coming to protect their own. So that's the situation. So yes, people can have very bad experiences, not necessarily transgender, various others, based on individual biases of doctors, nurses, and other people. And that's still very possible in Sri Lanka, and it continues to happen. That's true. Anyway, this is my opinion, right? So
thank you, sir. Before we wrap up, just one final question, and I think if Ms. Kushnani could ask this one. The question is, how should we deal with parents of LGBTQIA plus youth who are either clearly harming or causing distress to their children?
Thank you, Ramit. That's a very, very important question. And again, it depends really on the age of the child. I don't know, maybe Dr. Ganeshan can also weigh in on this. If the child is below 18, it's a completely different set of issues here. But often when in our clinical setup, if we come across clients who are experiencing discrimination by their parents, we try our best where possible to bring the parents in. There are many parents are still willing to have a conversation about it. So those who are willing, we end up having continued sessions with them to make them understand and empathize with their child's point of view. And in certain instances like that, I must say that we've been fairly successful where parents have actually relinquished their initial stance and actually been more open and accepting and tolerant. There were also parents who said, look, this is not my personal opinion, this is not my personal stance, but I do value my child's well-being and I do put my child's well-being first. And as a result of that, I am okay with it. But I may not necessarily approve of it from a more moralistic or from their particular frame of reference. This could be related to religious or cultural attitudes, for example, but they are willing. In the case of children below the age of 18, unfortunately, I haven't had any experiences dealing with cases like that. So I can't comment on it. Maybe Dr. Ganeshan might have some information on that. I don't know if I answered the question properly. If there is anything else, please ask.
Thank you, madam. No, that
okay.
Make it quite clear. And yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes, this is a common problem that we face. Parents would very often bring their children to us expecting what is called the conversion therapy. They may not use those words, but can't you do some counseling or medication, make this person, my child, see sense and see the truth and how God has made them, sort of thing.
Hello, Dr. Ganesan. I think we have had a slight technical issue and Dr. Ganesan has gotten disconnected.
And also after 18, they will have some freedom to do what they want to do. The danger is that if we kind of tell the parents, sorry, this is normal, go ahead, learn to adjust to it. The parents may take the child somewhere else to some religious healers or others where more harm could be done. So we try to make sure that we maintain contact. Say, okay, yeah, we are working, I'm talking to your child and, I think we are slowly moving gradually, but talk to the child in private and support them and teach the child to, play the game of kind of fooling the parents until they have the freedom and the space to do what they want to do. Unfortunately, this is the only way that we can take it forward. There is no other way because, there is religious healers, there are native healers, there are all type of people in the health sector. And it would be very easy for them to take to some religious healer where they will be whipped or chained or told that you are really bad, you are going to go to hell, etc., etc. So we try to prevent re-traumatization and damage and try to play the game. It is not ideal, but Well, at the moment, that's the only option we have, sort of. I hope I have answered your question, but.
Thanks. That was a very practical look into what actually might need to be done. Yes, we're slightly over time, but thank you very much for the questions and for the answers, dear speakers, and for the great discussion that has been going in during the chat. Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. During the chat, we haven't had time to discuss all of them, but it's very great that we've had this nice discussion going on. Just before we close off, we'd be very happy if we could have a photograph with all our contestants who have taken the time off their schedules. We all know everyone has time, despite some of us being at home, to take a photograph. So whoever would like to can please just start sharing their video, and we can take a screenshot of this webinar. We will be taking the screenshot in just, since time is running short, in 15 seconds, we'll take the screenshot. So 15 seconds, everyone, to turn the videos on. And Buddhi, are we ready?
Yeah.
All right. So we have 5, 3, 2, 1. Smile, everyone.
Okay.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll just end with a quick vote of thanks for everyone who helped in making this reality. I'd first like to thank our Dean, Vidya Jyoti, Professor Vajra Dissanayake, and also the Golden Z Club for providing all the permissions and support necessary to take this forward. I would like to thank our speakers, Mr. Tyagaraja Varadas, Ms. Bhumi Harendran, Ms. Kushani Munasinghe, Dr. Mahesan Ganesan, for taking the time off your schedules to inform us and let us know about what is happening regarding this situation and improve our outlook a little bit. I'd like to thank Professor Priyanjali D'Souza, our Senior Student Advisor of the Golden Z Club, for all the support she has given before this webinar, during this webinar, while it was happening, and in all our future projects as well. I'd like to thank Dr. Roshan Hevapatirana and the faculty administration for helping set up all these technical details and for making sure everything went smoothly. Our networking partners who shared all the promotional content prior to this and for sharing the links, the Medical Faculty Students Union of University of Colombo, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo, the Medical Students Welfare Society, the Physiotherapy Students Welfare Society, all of the University of Colombo, the Nursing Faculty Students Union of the University of Colombo, the Student Society of Physiotherapy, University of Peradeniya, Psychology Society, University of Peradeniya, and for everyone who was outside of these, who took the time to share these and make this a success. I want to thank our committee and the project coordinators for working very hard. We also had a large number of colleagues outside the Golden Z Club who assisted us, taking their time and energy to make this successful. And finally, all the attendees for their enthusiasm and for their presence here. I hope you had an informative session, and I thank you for the discussion and the discourse. I wish you a very good evening, and we can now close this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.